everyone, Terry Duncan here with Cut, Color, and Create. Today we're going to do layered stenciling. I've got an A2 size piece of light blue cardstock that I'm going to place in my stamp wheel. I've marked grids on my sticky mat so that it makes it easy to find where I want to put things. And I don't have it straight, so I'm going to straighten that up. And then I have the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to use anti-stick powder and brush that cardstock with the anti-stick powder. And we're doing that because we're going to heat emboss the stamped image. Now, I have already placed my stamp in the stamp wheel on the lid in the location that I want it. So I'm just going to ink it up with some watermark ink, making sure I get ink in all the little nooks and crannies of this huge stamp. And then I'm going to use my pressure tool to make sure I get a good image transferred over. And now I'll just peel that up. Set my stamp wheel aside for a second. I'm going to add some white embossing powder. Because the image is so large, I'm just going to do half at a time. And I'm just going to let that embossing powder sit for a second, not too long, but enough to let it sink into the ink. And now I'm going to do the other half. Same thing, let it sit for a minute. I always try to tap it off to make sure there isn't any excess powder where you don't want it to be, and give it blow it a little bit. Now we're going to use our heat gun. We're going to let that sit for 40 seconds. We do this so that the gun is good and hot before we start melting the powder. And I always like to start on the back of the cardstock first to heat it up from the back side. To me, I believe this helps with reducing the amount of warping that comes with heat embossing. There we go. And I'm just checking to make sure everything's shiny. I'm going to give this a little, one little touch here. And I think we're good to go. While that's cooling, I'm going to go ahead and set it back in my stamp wheel. I'm doing this so that I can use the sticky mat to hold my cardstock in place while I'm stenciling. So for this card, I'm using the new fresh dyes. You can see I've got a collection of blues that I'm going to use for this card. If you haven't tried these inks, I strongly recommend that you do. They are beautiful. They blend beautifully. They must have a smoothing agent in it, because even if they look a little splotchy when you put it down on the cardstock, that changes over time. So and they're beautiful colors. So you know, they are wonderful. So strongly recommend them. Now, as you can see, I've already been practicing with my stencils, but I'm just going to follow the guide that comes with the stamp set. I'll pull this over here so you can see. I'm using this double peony for this card, so I'm following this guide right here. And so the first step here is to use stencil 1. So that's what I'm doing. And I'm just going to place that over the stencil, making sure that all the lines are kind of inside of the stencil before I stick it down. I think that's good. You can see the sticky mat kind of creates a section that holds that stencil down. Now, I have two mini brushes, one that's kind of in lighter tones, the other is in darker tones. And I am going to use a piece of paper towel to clean my brush just to make sure that when I go to the lightest blue that I don't have any darker ink on my brush. But I do have the two, one for a lighter blue and one for a darker blue. So I'm starting with the water hyacinth, which is the lightest blue. And I'm going to ink that up real good. And I'm just going to dab it off on the stencil a little bit. And then I'm going to start to gently blend the ink onto the stencil. And I like to shade with the amount of darkness for each of the colors. So I don't know if you can, if the camera picks it up or not, but I like to make where the flower petals attached to the center a little bit darker than the tips. And so I'm doing that with each of these petals, just using a circular motion, both directions, to make sure I get in all the little nooks and crannies. And I'm holding this centerpiece down because there's not much there to hold it to the stencil, and it could bend if you don't hold it, or you could get part of your brush underneath the stencil and then it would ruin the image that you're stenciling. So it's good to just hold that down with your finger. And we're just kind of giving the flower a wash with this first layer, a wash of color. If you're not careful, you can get ink where you don't want it. As you can see, I've got my stencils marked. I did that with actually a golf ball marking marker, which seems to do a good job of staying on even when I wash the stencils. And that way I can tell where there are different places for different uses of the stencil. So that's my first layer. Okay. Now I'm going to cover that up, go with the next darker color. Following my guide, I'm going to go to stencil number 2. So I'll lift this one up. And again, I'm going to follow the guide where it helps you to align what you're doing. Hopefully I've got that in the right place. It doesn't look like I do. Oh, here we go. Let's try something different down here. So you can see the lines here. I'm following those lines instead. And that helped me get the stencil right where I need it to be. Okay. And now I'm still using the lighter brush. I don't have to clean it off because I used a lighter ink before. I'm holding down the stencil in places where it seems like it's popping up a little bit, and I'm just going to start to add color. And again, remembering that the center, whoops, I moved that stencil. Okay. And I'm going from the centers out towards the tips. And I'm just adding this second color all over. And now you can see our image is starting to come to life. Isn't that pretty already? Okay, now we're going with the next step, which is stencil number 3. And I'm going to use that same location. You can see that my stencil did shift a little bit, but I think it's going to be okay. I'm going with it anyway. Because we're adding so many different colors in, I don't think it'll make much difference. And like I said earlier, I just like to make sure that all the outlines are inside of the stencil. This time I'm doing a better job of sticking things down. I'm going to switch to the Crystal Violet. And this time I am going to go with my darker brush. I'm going to clean that off just to make sure I don't have a really dark ink on. And it looks like I did. And so I'm going to pick up a little bit of ink and follow the same steps. Just make sure you rotate. Make sure you don't get over the edge. Although there is a coordinating die just to if you get it over the edge, then you can cut out the image and save the project. And I'm still sticking with darker in the center. Okay, that's layer number 3. So pretty. And then we're going to go back to layer number 1 or stencil number 1. And that is this one. And that goes right here. Apologize for my head peeking in there. But sometimes you just have to get right over the top of your project. Now I'm going to use Indigo Skies for this layer. Again, I'm using my darkest brush. I'm going to be careful so that I don't get any ink down here or up there. There's a lot of heat embossed ink there, so there's a lot of white peeking through, but this is really going to be pretty. Now, what I am going to do, because that ink is on top of that embossing, I'm going to take my paper towel and I'm just going to rub it a little bit to get the ink off of the embossing. Now we're going to do the leaves, and I'm making this monochromatic. So I'm going to use, I'm going to stick with the blues. What I am going to do is bring in one more blue. Actually, one that's not available yet, but will be out soon. And that is navy. So instead of starting with water hyacinth, I'm done with that for this project. But I'm going to go on following my instructions here, or the guide. I'm going to use stencil number 2. And this time I'm going to use Alpine Aster. And this is what we're going to be stenciling. And it's easy to line up. And I've already got Alpine Aster on my brush, so I'm not going to worry about cleaning it off. And I'm just going to blend that on. This has a couple of places that on the stencil that could get bent. So you have to be kind of careful. You see how just a little bit darker in the center creates some dimension there. So that is layer 1 of the leaves. And now I'm going to use layer 3, stencil number 3. I'm going to put the cover on my Alpine Aster. I don't think I'm done with that yet, so I'm not going to fasten it down. Crystal Violet is the next color. And for layer 3, lining it up beautifully. And now I'm going to go with the darker brush. And that's it for that leaf. Now we're going to go back to layer 1, stencil number 1, to get these other leaves. And get that lined up good. And I'm going to go back to the Alpine Aster. Put my brush away so it doesn't roll somewhere I can't get to. Okay, that's the first layer of that leaf. Now we're going to go to stencil number 3. And this time I'm going to use Crystal Violet, my darker brush. Just making sure that's aligned well. Okay, now I'm going to go back to layer 2, excuse me, stencil number 2. I'm going to put the cover on the Crystal Violet. And this time I'm going to use Indigo Skies. Yeah, perfect. And then stencil number 3, one last little accent. I'm just going to put the lids on these so I don't. What I like about, another thing I like about the inks is that they stack like this. You can see I've put labels on them with the colors so you can sit them on a shelf. Enough of that. And the last one I'm going to use is the newer color, navy. I'm going to line that up real well. Carefully lift that off. And there is our beautiful layered stencil piece. Isn't that gorgeous? See all the dimension with those different colors? Now, I'm going to just set this aside and we're going to pick out a sentiment. There's hello, beautiful. Together we can do great things. Sending lots of love and hugs. I kind of like that. And see, it'll fit beautifully right in there. Yeah, I think I will use that. And what I'm going to do is, well, I guess I'm going to bring my stamp positioner back. And I'm going to locate where I want my sentiment to be. I use this little transparency grid. It is a lifesaver for me. And I'm just going to place that right there. Making sure I get it straight. Oops, sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't see that because of my head, my frizzy hair. Now I'm taking the stamp, the flower stamp off of my lid. I have marked strategic spots on my lid so that I can tell where it is at all times. And so I've got this green dot up at the top to pick up my sentiment. And then I pick it up and remove the transparency grid. I'm going to flip that over. And I am going to use this ink, this navy ink, to stamp the sentiment. And you know what? I have never used this stamp before, so I am going to use a scrap piece of paper. Just going to set that over the top of it to stamp that off. Oh, it did a pretty nice job. And we'll stamp that image of the sentiment. Ooh, pretty. I'm going to just ink that up one more time, just because I like to double stamp. Beautiful. Okay, I'm going to set that aside. And I'm going to set my stamp wheel aside. And I'm going to grab myself a folding card panel. Just going to double check to make sure the size is good, and it is. And I'm going to show you a little trick that I discovered works really well for me. I'm just checking to make sure the ink is dry. I think it is. So I'm going to put it face down into my stamp wheel. Before I do that, I'm going to add some adhesive. So I'm going to use my tape runner. Just put it on all four edges. Always put a little bit in the center just for good measure. Now I'm taking note that the top of my piece is going to go down into this corner. I'm going to hold it in the upper right hand corner and then make sure it's snug in the lower hand corner and then fasten it down to the sticky mat. Now I'm going to do the same thing with my card base. I'm going to flip it over so that the fold or the top is at the top, at the bottom. I'm going to hold it in the upper right hand corner of what I'm holding, and I'm going to push it snug into that corner so that it aligns up, and then press it down. I have struggled with getting card panels straight on card bases, and this technique really helps me. And see, there you have it. Card panel is set perfectly on the card front. Now, I think there's one thing I think I'm going to do, and that is I'm going to do a little bit of blending along the edges just to set off the centerpiece. I really think that it needs that, and hopefully I don't ruin the card. So here we go. And I'm going to do that with, I think I'll use Alpine Aster for that. I'm going to clean my brush off just to be sure again that I've got the right color. Now this time I'm going to make sure that I tap off so that I don't have a big glob of color hit it. And I'm just, actually, you know, I think I'm going to do this on paper so that it slides instead of sticks. Here we go. So this is what I wanted to just kind of that's catching a little bit. So I think what I'm going to do is mask it off. There, that's better. Not too much. You see, I haven't re-inked my brush at all. We're just distressing the edge a little bit to add just a tad more focus on the centerpiece. And that is it, our monochrome layered stenciled card. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this. Check out the links below and, or this way, check out the links below for all the supplies that we're using.